Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The War on Cops, How the New Attack on Law and Order Makes Everyone Less Safe, by Heather MacDonald, narrated by Pam Ward. Introduction. The Policing Revolution, Crime, and the Anti-Law Enforcement Movement. As the most anti-law enforcement administration in memory draws to a close, crime is shooting up in cities across the United States. Homicides in the country's 50 largest cities rose nearly 17% in 2015, the greatest surge in fatal violence in a quarter century, reports The Washington Post. Milwaukee was experiencing its deadliest year in a decade. Homicides in Baltimore were at their highest per capita rate ever by mid-November, 50 killings per 100,000 residents. "Crime is the worst I've ever seen it," said St. Louis Alderman Joe Vaccaro at a City Hall hearing in May 2015. President Obama himself conceded that gun violence and homicides have spiked, and in some cases they've spiked significantly. The crime surge was especially troubling in that it reversed a 2-decade-long decline, during which American cities vanquished a 1960s-era notion that had made urban life miserable for so many. Breaking the law, the thinking went, was but a symptom of social failure and governmental neglect, or even an understandable expression of protest. Until poverty and racism were eliminated, routine behaviors such as walking down a street, strolling through a park, or operating a store would necessarily remain fraught with fear and the possibility of violence. Under the influence of this root causes conceit, acres of city space were ceded to thieves and thugs, to hustlers and graffiti artists. Disorder and decay became the urban norm. A combination of forces eventually reversed this state of affairs. Starting in the late 1970s, legislators demanded that convicted criminals serve more of their sentences. Habitual felons were finally locked up for lengthy prison stays. And police leaders challenged the root causes concept with a countervailing idea. The police could actually prevent crime, and in doing so would make civilized urban life possible again. This sea change in policing philosophy originated in New York in 1994 under Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, a former U.S. attorney who had campaigned on the promise to free the city from its growing squalor and anarchy. Giuliani's first police commissioner, William J. Bratton, was a champion of broken windows policing, which holds that allowing a neighborhood to become overrun by graffiti, litter, public drunkenness, and other forms of disorder breeds more crime by signaling that social control in the area has collapsed. Bratton had already shown the effectiveness of broken windows enforcement in New York's subways as transit police chief in the early 1990s. Now he would have an entire city upon which to test the concept. Bratton's deputy commissioners began rigorously analyzing crime data on a daily basis and ruthlessly holding precinct commanders accountable for the safety of their precincts. And they asked officers to stop and question individuals engaged in suspicious behavior, whether hanging out on a known drug corner at 1 a.m. or casing a jewelry store on a commercial strip plagued by burglaries. Crime in New York City dropped 12% in Bratton's first year in office, and 16% the next year, while crime rates in the rest of the country were virtually flat. The New York crime rout became national news, spurring other police departments to adopt similar data-intensive, proactive tactics. Over the next 2 decades, crime would fall 50% nationwide, revitalizing cities across the country. The biggest beneficiaries of the crime decline were the law-abiding residents of minority neighborhoods. Senior citizens could go out to shop without fear of getting mugged. Businesses moved into formerly desolate areas. Children no longer had to sleep in bathtubs to avoid getting hit by stray bullets. And tens of thousands of individuals were spared premature death by homicide. Now that triumph over chaos and lawlessness is in jeopardy. Fueling the rising crime in places like Baltimore and Milwaukee is a multi-pronged attack on law enforcement. Since late summer 2014, a protest movement known as Black Lives Matter has convulsed the nation. Triggered by a series of highly publicized deaths of black males at the hands of the police, the Black Lives Matter movement holds that police officers are the greatest threat facing young black men today. That belief has spawned riots, die-ins, and the assassination of police officers. The movement's targets include broken windows policing and the practice of stopping and questioning suspicious individuals, both of which are said to harass blacks. At the same time, a long-standing academic discourse about mass incarceration went mainstream. According to this theory, the American penal system practices systematic imprisonment of whole groups. The nation's prison rate is allegedly a product of discrimination, and drug laws are purportedly a means of re-enslaving black Americans. President Obama repeatedly charged that the criminal justice system treats blacks differently from whites. In New York City, a trilogy of lawsuits challenged the NYPD's stop, question, and frisk tactics as racist. A federal judge ruled in favor of the plaintiffs by ignoring the incidence of crime in minority neighborhoods. A previously obscure politician, Bill de Blasio, ascended to City Hall 2 decades after Mayor Giuliani by campaigning against the NYPD and pledging to drop the city's appeal of the stop, question, and frisk decision. As 2015 progressed, few law enforcement practices escaped attack for allegedly imposing unjust burdens on blacks. But it was the virulent anti-cop rhetoric that was most consequential. Officers working in inner cities routinely found themselves surrounded by hostile, jeering crowds when they tried to make an arrest or conduct an investigation. Cops feared becoming the latest YouTube pariah when a viral cell phone video showed them using force against a suspect who had been resisting arrest. In response, the police began to disengage from proactive policing. Rather than getting out of their squad cars to question an individual who appeared to be hiding a gun, officers increasingly just drove on by, waiting for the next robbery or shooting to come over the police radio. Criminal summons and misdemeanor arrests for public order offenses plummeted. If the Black Lives Matter movement were correct, this fall-off in discretionary policing should have been a boon to black lives. Instead, a bloodbath ensued, and its victims were virtually all black. When the cops back off, blacks pay the greatest price. That truth would have come as no surprise to the legions of inner-city residents who fervently support the police and whose voices are almost never heard in the media. The Black Lives Matter narrative about racist law enforcement occurred in a vacuum. Carefully excluded was any acknowledgement of inner-city crime and social breakdown. It was as if officers arbitrarily deployed more heavily in certain neighborhoods out of a sheer desire to oppress. In reality, the police were in those areas because, despite the record-breaking crime drop of the 1990s and 2000s, a culture of drive-by shootings and gang warfare persisted, largely due to the breakdown of the black family. That reality was assiduously kept off stage, leaving the focus exclusively on the alleged bias of the police. This book challenges the premises of the growing crusade against law enforcement. In Part 1, I rebut the founding myths of the Black Lives Matter movement, including the lie that a Pacific Michael Brown was gunned down in cold blood by Officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri, in August 2014. I document the hotly contested Ferguson effect, a trend that I first spotted nationally, wherein officers desist from discretionary policing and criminals thus become emboldened. In Part 2, I outline the development of the misguided legal push to force the NYPD to give up its stop, question, and frisk tactic. In Part 3, I analyze criminogenic environments in Chicago and Philadelphia and put to rest the excuse that crime, black crime especially, is the result of poverty and inequality. Finally, in Part 4, I expose the deceptions of the mass incarceration conceit and show that the disproportionate representation of blacks in prison is actually the result of violence, not racism. However much the recent crime increase threatens the vitality of America's cities and thousands of lives, it is not, in itself, the greatest danger in today's war on cops. The greatest danger lies, rather, in the delegitimation of law and order itself. Riots are returning to the urban landscape. Police officers are regularly pelted with bricks and water bottles during the course of their duties. Black criminals who have been told that the police are racist are more likely to resist arrest, requiring the arresting officer to use force and risk an even more violent encounter. If the present lies about law enforcement continue, civilized urban life may once again break down. Part 1. Burning Cities and the Ferguson Effect. The August 2014 police shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, spawned a narrative as stubborn as it was false. Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson had allegedly shot the 18-year-old gentle giant in cold blood, while the latter was pleading for his life, hands raised in surrender. After Brown's death, rioters torched and looted Ferguson businesses. The facts were that Brown, a budding criminal who weighed nearly 300 pounds, had punched Wilson in the face, tried to grab Wilson's gun, and charged at him, leading Wilson to fire in self-defense. In the months that followed, the lie that Brown had died in a racially motivated police execution was amplified by the media, college presidents, and the left-wing political class. The newly formed Black Lives Matter movement promoted the notion that Black American males were being hunted down and killed with impunity by renegade white police officers. Eric Garner, who had died after a forceful police takedown on Staten Island, New York, was added to the list of martyrs to racist police brutality. Riots broke out in Ferguson for a second time in November 2014, when a grand jury declined to indict Wilson for Brown's death. Black Lives Matter protests grew even more virulent as a second myth took hold, that the American criminal justice system is rigged against blacks. In December 2014, Ismael Abdullah Brinsley assassinated officers Wenjian Liu and Rafael Ramos of the New York Police Department in retaliation for the deaths of Garner and Brown. Police actions in minority neighborhoods became increasingly tense. Suspects and bystanders routinely challenged officers' lawful authority. Slandered in the media and targeted on the streets, officers reverted to a model of purely reactive policing that had been out of vogue since the early 1990s. The inevitable result? Violent crime surged in city after city as criminals began reasserting themselves, a phenomenon that I and others controversially described as the Ferguson effect. President Barack Obama's FBI Director James Comey confirmed the Ferguson effect in a speech at the University of Chicago Law School in October 2015. The rise in homicides and shootings in the nation's 50 largest cities was likely due to the chill wind blowing through American law enforcement over the last year, he said, a wind that is surely changing behavior. Sadly, the president himself contributed directly to that chill wind against the nation's police forces. Chapter 1. Obama's Ferguson Sellout. On November 24, 2014, President Obama betrayed the nation. Even as he went on national television to respond to the grand jury decision not to indict Officer Darren Wilson for fatally shooting 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, the looting and arson that had followed Brown's shooting in August were being reprised, destroying businesses and livelihoods over the next several hours. Obama had one job and one job only in his address that day: to defend the workings of the criminal justice system and the rule of law. Instead, he turned his talk into a primer on police racism and criminal justice bias. In so doing, he perverted his role as the leader of all Americans and as the country's most visible symbol of the primacy of the law. Obama gestured wanly toward the need to respect the grand jury's decision and to protest peacefully. "We are a nation built on the rule of law, and so we need to accept that this decision was the grand jury's to make," he said. But his tone of voice and body language unmistakably conveyed his disagreement, if not disgust, with that decision. "There are Americans who are deeply disappointed, even angry. It's an understandable reaction," he said. Understandable, so long as one ignores the evidence presented to the grand jury. The testimony of a half-dozen black observers at the scene had demolished the early incendiary reports that Wilson attacked Brown in cold blood and shot Brown in the back when his hands were up. Those early witnesses who had claimed gratuitous brutality on Wilson's part contradicted themselves and were, in turn, contradicted by the physical evidence and by other witnesses who corroborated Wilson's testimony that Brown had attacked him and had tried to grab his gun. Minutes before, the hefty Brown had thuggishly robbed a diminutive shopkeeper of a box of cigarillos. Wilson had received a report of that robbery and a description of Brown before stopping him. Obama should have briefly reiterated the grounds for not indicting Wilson and applauded the decision as the product of a scrupulously thorough and fair process. He should have praised the jurors for their service and courage in following the evidence where it led them, and he should have concluded by noting that there is no fairer criminal justice system in the world than the one we have in the United States. Instead, Obama reprimanded local police officers in advance for an expected overreaction to the protests. I also appeal to the law enforcement officials in Ferguson and the region to show care and restraint in managing peaceful protests that may occur. They need to work with the community, not against the community, to distinguish the handful of people who may use the grand jury's decision as an excuse for violence from the vast majority who just want their voices heard around legitimate issues in terms of how communities and law enforcement interact. Such skepticism about the ability of the police to maintain the peace appropriately was unwarranted at the time, and even more so in retrospect. The forces of law and order didn't fire a single shot, nor did they inflict injury, despite having been fired at themselves. Missouri's governor, Jay Nixon, was under attack for days for having authorized a potential mobilization of the National Guard, as if the August rioting didn't more than justify such a precaution. Any small business owner facing another wave of violence would have been desperate for such protection and more. Though Nixon didn't actually call up the Guard, his prophylactic declaration of a state of emergency proved prescient. Obama left no doubt that he believed the narrative of the mainstream media and race activists about Ferguson. That narrative held that the shooting of Brown was a symbol of nationwide police misbehavior, and that the August riots were an understandable reaction to widespread societal injustice. The situation in Ferguson speaks to broader challenges that we still face as a nation. The fact is, in too many parts of this country, a deep distrust exists between law enforcement and communities of color. This distrust was justified in Obama's view. He reinvoked the diversity bromide about the racial composition of police forces, implying that white officers cannot fairly police black communities. Yet some of the most criticized law enforcement bodies in recent years have, in fact, been majority black. We have made enormous progress in race relations, Obama conceded. But what is also true is that there are still problems, and communities of color aren't just making these problems up. The law too often feels like it's being applied in a discriminatory fashion. These are real issues, and we have to lift them up and not deny them or try to tamp them down. To claim that the laws are applied in a discriminatory fashion was a calumny, unsupported by evidence. For the President of the United States to put his imprimatur on such propaganda was bad enough. To do so following a verdict in so incendiary a case was grossly irresponsible. But such partiality followed the pattern of this administration in Ferguson and elsewhere, with Attorney General Eric Holder prematurely declaring the Ferguson police force in need of wholesale change, and President Obama invoking Ferguson at the United Nations as a manifestation of America's ethnic strife. The wanton destruction that followed the grand jury's decision was overdetermined. For weeks, the press had been salivating at the potential for black violence. The New York Times ran several stories a day, most on the front page, about such a prospect. Media coverage of racial tension portrayed black violence as customary, and riots as virtually a black entitlement. The press dusted off hoary tropes about police stops and racism, echoing the anti-law enforcement agitation and the crusade against racial profiling of the 1990s. The New York Times selected various features of Ferguson almost at random and declared them racist, simply by virtue of their being associated with the city where Michael Brown was killed, a theme that Chapter 2 examines further. A similar conceit emerged regarding the grand jury investigation. Innocent or admirable aspects of the prosecutor's management of the case, such as the quantity of evidence presented, were blasted as the product of a flawed or deliberately tainted process. So desperate were the activists to discredit the grand jury's decision. This kind of misinformation about the criminal justice system and the police can only increase hatred of the police. That hatred, in turn, will heighten the chances of more Michael Browns attacking officers and getting shot themselves. Police officers in the tensest areas may hold off from assertive policing. Such depolicing will leave thousands of law-abiding minority residents who fervently support the police ever more vulnerable to thugs. Obama couldn't have stopped the violence in Ferguson with his address to the nation, but in casting his lot with those who speciously impugn our criminal justice system, he increased the likelihood of more such violence in the future. Chapter 2. Ferguson's Unasked Questions. Press reports on the Ferguson unrest, as the media prefer to call such violence, quickly began to reveal an operative formula. Select some aspect of the city's political or civic culture, declare it racist by virtue of its association with Ferguson, disregard alternative explanations for the phenomenon, blame it for the riots. Bonus move, generalize to other cities with similar problems. By this process, the media could easily reach predetermined conclusions. For example, Ferguson's population is 2/3 black, but 5 of its 6 city council members are white, as is its mayor. Conclusion, this racial composition must be the product of racism. Never mind that blacks barely turn out to vote, and that they field practically no candidates. Never mind that the mayor ran for a second term unopposed. Is there a record of Ferguson's supposed white power structure suppressing the black vote? None has been alleged. Did the rioters even know who their mayor and city council representatives were? The press didn't bother to ask. It only saw an example of what was imagined to be a disturbingly widespread problem. In a front-page story complete with a sophisticated scattergraph visual aid, the New York Times summed up the problem. Mostly black cities, mostly white city halls. Another example, Ferguson issues fines for traffic violations, and 20% of its municipal budget comes from such receipts. If people with outstanding fines or summonses don't appear in court, a warrant for their arrest is issued. Conclusion, this is a racist system. The city is deliberately financing its operations on the backs of the black poor. The only reason that blacks are subject to fines and warrants, according to the media, is that they are being hounded by a racist police force. A mostly white police force has targeted blacks for a disproportionate number of stops and searches, declared Time, September 1st. What was the evidence for such targeting? Time provided none. Might blacks be getting traffic fines for the same reason that whites get traffic fines? Because they broke the law? The possibility was not considered. The most frequently summoned traffic offense is driving without insurance, according to an exposé of Ferguson's traffic fine system by the New York Times. Perhaps the paper's editors would be blasé about being hit by an uninsured driver, but most drivers would be grateful that the insurance requirement is being enforced. Might poor blacks have a higher rate of driving without insurance than other drivers? Not relevant to know, apparently. The next highest categories of driving infraction are blasting loud music out your car and driving with tinted windows. If you attend police and community meetings in poor areas, you will regularly hear complaints about cars with deafening sound systems. Should the police ignore such complaints? Are they ignoring similar complaints in white areas because they want to give whites a pass? Do Ferguson's white and black drivers blast loud music from their cars at the same rate? We never learn. Tinted windows pose a possibly lethal threat to the police during traffic stops, since they prevent officers from assessing the situation inside the car before approaching. Ignoring this infraction puts officers' lives at risk. Should the police nevertheless do so? Such is the implication, if doing so would mean fewer fines for black motorists. The New York Times quotes a victim of the racist Ferguson traffic enforcement system who was fined for driving without a license. Why was his license suspended? Was he driving drunk? Did he hit someone? We will never know. What is the crime rate in the black areas of Ferguson? That is also something that the mainstream press is not interested in finding out. The most ubiquitous Ferguson is racist meme was that the city's police force is too white. 4 of Ferguson's 53 officers are black. This imbalance, it was suggested, must be the result of racism and must itself cause racist enforcement activity. How many qualified black applicants have been rejected after applying to join the Ferguson police force? Not an interesting question, evidently. The too white police force meme, which the New York Times generalized into another front-page article, Mostly White Forces in Mostly Black Towns, September 10th, complete with another impressive set of graphs, is of particular interest in light of the federal government's investigation of New York City's sprawling Rikers Island jail complex. In August 2014, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York issued a report denouncing the deep-seated culture of violence among Rikers corrections officers toward adolescent inmates. He accused guards of handcuffing juvenile inmates to gurneys and beating them. Rikers had been bedeviled by such claims of officer abuse of inmates for years. But the resulting problem for the abusive white cops meme is that the Rikers officer force is about 2/3 black. New York's population is 23% black, but no one has complained about the racial imbalance among Rikers guards. Also, in August, the Detroit Police Department emerged from 11 years of federal oversight for alleged abuse of civilians, including a pattern of unjustified shootings. The Detroit force, too, is about 2/3 black. In 2012, after a 2-year investigation for a pattern of civil rights violations, the U.S. Justice Department imposed on the New Orleans Police Department an exceptionally expansive consent decree, a nominally consensual agreement overseen by a court, to try to rein in the alleged unconstitutional behavior of its officers, the majority of whom are black. Now, perhaps these civil rights allegations against these majority black forces are trumped up. But if so, perhaps similar allegations against majority white forces are too. Or maybe the race of officers has little to do with whether they can police fairly. As the grand jury was deliberating over whether to charge Darren Wilson with murder for shooting Michael Brown, cops were being shot at in and around Ferguson. Authorities hastily discounted any connection with the ongoing protests. Death threats against police officers multiplied. Even after the grand jury found insufficient grounds to indict Officer Wilson, the media kept flogging a story that was driven by facile and ultimately dangerous preconceptions. Chapter 3. Finding Meaning in Ferguson. Shortly after President Obama's speech on the grand jury decision, the New York Times officially pronounced on the meaning of the Ferguson riots. A more perfect example of what the late Daniel Patrick Moynihan called defining deviancy down would be hard to find. The Times editorial encapsulated the elite narrative around the shooting of Michael Brown and the mayhem that twice followed it. The Times could not bring itself to say one word of condemnation against the savages who self-indulgently destroyed the livelihoods of struggling entrepreneurs and their employees in Ferguson, Missouri. The real culprit behind the riots, in the Times' view, was not the actual arsonists and looters. It was Robert McCulloch, the county prosecutor who presented the shooting of Brown by Officer Darren Wilson to a St. Louis County grand jury. After hearing 3 months of testimony, the grand jury decided not to bring criminal charges against Wilson. The Times recited a now familiar litany of McCulloch's alleged improprieties, turning the virtues of this grand jury, such as its methodical thoroughness, into flaws. If the jurors had indicted Wilson, none of the riot apologists would have complained about the length of the process or the range of evidence presented. To be sure, most grand jury proceedings are pro forma and brief because the evidence of the defendant's guilt is so.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?